Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm Sharon Selvaggio. I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And for those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit conservation organization, and our mission is to protect the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates. I'm co-presenting today with Ridge Campbell, the greenhouse manager from MNL Nursery. And I'm opening our presentation, and I'm super excited in this brief intro to have a chance to tell you about a program that Xerces has been developing that allows us to source nursery plants that we believe are safe for both bees and butterflies. And knowing what we do at Xerces about pesticide risk to pollinators, we feel a really big responsibility to ensure those plants are as pollinator safe as possible. So let's get started here. So Ridge is going to talk about the growing pollinator-safe plants part, and I'm going to talk about how and why Xerces strives to source these pollinator-safe plants and how you can too. So let's start by looking at some market research. In 2022, hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Americans spent $10.8 billion on plantings to support pollinators and other wildlife around their homes. And this is showing up as increased demand for native plants, for pollinator plants, and crucially for sustainably produced plants. So that there's been a study that looked into the kind of sustainability practices that consumers want, and bee-friendly practices actually top the list. In 2025 dollars, consumers will pay $1.52 more per plant. By the way, that $10.8 billion that people are spending every year, that's more than what people spent on Black Friday purchases a couple of years ago. So people are helping with biodiversity solutions, which is really great news. But we also know that on average, the floriculture and nursery sector uses significantly more pesticides per acre than even field food crops in the US. So there have been a number of studies that look at these nursery plants, finding multiple pesticides in a single nursery plant sample, typically. And sometimes those concentrations, especially of insecticides in nursery plants, are at levels that are high enough that they can kill bees or butterflies. And insecticides tend to be damaging on their own, many of them, not all, as damaging as others, but even fungicides can be harmful on their own. They also can be more harmful in combination. And in the nursery sector, there's a pretty heavy use of systemic pesticides, the kinds of pesticides that get inside the plant. Once they're inside the plant, they can actually linger for months to years, especially in woody plants. So for all the people wanting to bring nature home or do restoration, there is a real question. How can I find pollinator-safe plants? And we've been grappling with this as an organization as we buy plants. And these same questions are the crux that led to the solutions that I'd like to talk about today. Let's look at another study here for a minute, though. Prior to 2022, there had been a number of studies that looked at pesticides in nursery plants and the risks that they can pose for bees. But we were curious about whether milkweed plants pose risk for butterflies. We do regularly receive, unfortunately, phone calls from people who see monarch caterpillars dying on milkweeds that they recently planted. So we designed a study in collaboration with researchers at the University of Nevada, and we bought 235 plants from 33 retailers, large and small, around the country, and we sent them off to the lab to figure out what was inside of them. And we found overall 61 pesticides on these 235 plants, with an average plant having 12.2 pesticides per plant. Now, that included insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides in that overall sample. The range, though, was really wide. It was anywhere between 2 pesticides per 20 up to 28 per plant. And that was kind of a clue that there's a huge range of philosophies and practices amongst growers and possibly retailers too. And so some are successfully growing milkweed with very few pesticides, and others are offering plants with more than 2 dozen pesticides on those plants. So, looking deeper at the data, we tried to figure out what are the implications for monarchs. And one of the difficult aspects of the study was that at the time, monarch susceptibility to pesticides hadn't been very well studied. There was standardized data from the EPA on bees, but at the time, there were only 9 of the 61 chemicals that we found that had actually been tested on monarchs. But even with that, we saw that 38% of the milkweeds that we tested contained certain kinds of fungicides, strobin fungicides, at levels that had been associated in previous studies with reduced monarch wing length. So the caterpillars are eating the monarch plant, they pupate, turn into adults, and when strobin fungicides are at a certain concentration, those adults are smaller. That may not sound like a really big deal, but wing length in monarchs has actually been correlated with their migratory ability. So it was definitely concerning. Now, we also saw that nearly 70% of the milkweeds contained some highly toxic, persistent, and systemic insecticides, which we consider higher risk. On average, there were 1.6 higher risk insecticides per plant, and sometimes they were found at very high concentrations. But you can see from the percent positive detections that one or more of these was pretty frequent throughout the study. And the ones in yellow are the ones that show as higher risk. Unfortunately, so this shows how common these insecticides can be on plants that consumers are buying, even plants that are well known for their value for iconic insects. Now, as I mentioned, originally we really didn't have much toxicity data in the literature to really understand how these pesticides might be affecting monarchs. But after our study was published, a researcher at the University of Florida, Bernadette Mock, did her own study, and she used a number of different common nursery insecticides that happened to be systemic. She designed her study to spray them on leaves and allow them to degrade for 2 weeks before even introducing the monarch caterpillars. Essentially, she was interested in this question is basically if the plants sit for 2 weeks without monarchs on them, are they still toxic to monarchs? Well, they were. Out of I think she tested a total of 6 synthetic insecticides. And as you can see from this here, they killed anywhere between 40 to 100% of the pupa. Now, her sample sizes were kind of small, but the sort of like overall direction of these, even when the plants were allowed to sit for 2 weeks, was really pretty concerning. And 3 of the chemicals that she tested were also found in milkweeds in our own study. I show this column here just to show because in California, that state actually requires producers to report their pesticide use, so we know by the type of grower which chemicals are most widely used. And imidacloprid, which is a neonic that resulted in 80% of death of caterpillars or pupae under Bernadette's study, is still the number one insecticide used in the California nursery and greenhouse sector. So we've just documented a pretty difficult challenge when we look at the nursery industry overall. Pesticide use is common. This means that even iconic plants like milkweeds may be sold with pesticide residues that might be dangerous to monarchs or to bees. This was, of course, just the latest study showing that we've got concerns on this issue. But to be real, this is a difficult problem for nurseries. How does a nursery balance their plant production and pollinator safety, especially when consumers often demand perfect looking plants? And in nurseries, you can have a lot of damaging pests and insects. And how do buyers, such as ourselves, whether you're a restorationist or a home gardener, find those pollinator-safe plants? So let's move to some effective solutions that we've been pioneering that we hope you can apply yourselves. Well, first of all, we buy a lot of plants from nurseries because since 2019, we've been supplying habitat kits with free native pollinator attractive plants. We've purchased 600,000 plants from nurseries in the last 7 years, distributed to 2,000 projects across the country. When we started, we were mostly focused on getting those plants that are really attractive to pollinators, the native plants in a particular region, the ecotypes that were appropriate for that region. But we really began to start to examine how can we make these pollinator safe as well. And so the first step that we took is we started talking to all of our nurseries about their pest management and pesticide practices. We learned a lot along the way about how nurseries produce, how they prevent pests, what kind of pesticides they were using. So this is a useful step for us, and we do this with all the nurseries we source from still today. We prioritize purchases from nurseries that had more robust integrated pest management practices. These are practices that allow them to prevent pest outbreaks through changing the conditions that might really favor pests. It's practices that allow them to keep track of how pests are developing. They can develop very quickly in greenhouse settings, which tend to be warm, humid. Sometimes in a week, a problem can just explode. And we looked at the way nurseries were using pesticides, when they were using them, how they were using them, what they were using. And we try to prioritize from nurseries, again, with these robust practices. And we put some guidelines and principles of this in this Offering Be Safe Plants fact sheet, which you can find at our website. Another solution that we eventually implemented that has been working really well for us is to contract grow with nurseries who are willing to follow guidance that avoids hidden risks from the most harmful pesticides. We designed these stipulations to be protective for bees and for butterflies, both adult and larval forms. And specifically, we asked nurseries to stay away from, basically not use throughout the whole growing period, 22 systemic insecticides. And then we asked that they disallow several dozen other pesticides the last 2 weeks before delivery. So could you do this? I think you could, because anyone who uses contract grows can follow this process, especially larger buyers such as restoration organizations, cities, campuses, or any group really that coordinates plant purchases. You can find out more about the details in this Supplying Pollinator-Safe Nursery Plants fact sheet. Here's the QR code that will allow you to access it, and it's at our website. So we set a really high bar, and honestly, we were nervous. We were not sure that nurseries would accept these comprehensive restrictions. But now we have 13 nurseries across the country that have agreed to grow for us using these very restrictive specifications in contract grows for us. We asked some of our nurseries last year, how is this going for you? Are you seeing costs increase? Are you having logistical issues? Is there anything else that we need to know about how this is working? And overall, we found costs did not increase, and nurseries are making this work, sometimes even expanding these same practices to plants they're growing for other people. We did find that several nurseries told us they have new logistical and communication practices in place to help make sure that they know exactly which plants are subject to these really high protections. But what if you don't have enough buying power to contract grow? You can still seek out pollinator-safe plants. First of all, I just will say I talked to a nursery earlier this week where a contract grow with them can be as few as 200 plants. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be buying thousands of plants at once. Every nursery might have a different threshold for that. But if you are just looking for plants for your own home garden, you can still seek out seeds that have been grown organically or organic plants. These can be hard to find though. There's not that many nurseries that grow organically. So the next step that you can take is to avoid the plants that have grown with neonics or similar systemic insecticides. And then get into a conversation with your nursery. Go a little bit deeper, ask what steps they take to provide plants grown with pollinator-safe pest management. Again, I provided a QR code here that would give you access to our fact sheet on buying Be Safe plants. And we've heard from nurseries and from a lot of people that we've talked to about doing this over the years. This is not an easy thing to do necessarily. So we put together some videos, short Instagram reels that are actually posted on our website now. Here's another QR code. I hope I'm not boring you with all of these, but it makes it a little bit easier for you to get to these in a quick presentation. And our wonderful social media person, Kaylee Slusser, put together these really great, short, informative videos that give you some really great tips about how to approach, how to interpret the responses, how to follow up. So these are hopefully going to be useful to you. You can find them at this link or at the QR code. So we also think that people can really have more success with these kinds of um, goals if you organize your friend or community. First of all, you're creating more habitat. You can have more leverage with nurseries if there's more people asking for the same thing. You might even be able to buy the plants cheaper that way. So, what does it look like to organize your friends or your community? Well, it might be as simple as bringing a friend or a relative along with you when you're shopping. It might be organizing your neighborhood into larger groups for plant purchases. If you already have a bunch of people living nearby who want pollinator plants, go together, work together on this. You might work with plant brokers who work with landscape firms to find plants all over. They may be able to help you with this. You can also work with large organizations such as city parks and counties and landscape associations. Make sure they are aware of ways to find pollinator-safe plants. You can share this information with them. Finally, if you want to really commit your city or your organization to these kinds of things, you can work on policy for your city or your county or your landscape association to pollinator safe plant purchasing commitments. So those are a few ideas that hopefully are helpful. So we'd love to know if this is useful for you and how you've taken action. And so if this is important to you and you're going to put this into place, please take the time to let us know. You can visit this form, fill something out. You can also contact me. I'm going to give my email address here in a second. Um, so just some takeaways. There's a market. We've got concerns about pesticide residues. The native plant buyers and producers are such important partners. And with all of us working together, we can contribute and make a difference. There's a lot of resources that we have available. Please check those out. So I'm going to transition now to Ridge, who's going to tell you about how MNL has been growing pollinator-safe plants. And I just want to say thanks to everybody who supports Xerces. We could not do this work without all of our members and funders. And here's an email address you can contact me at. If you want to become a member yourself, you can go to this link right here. So thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Ridge now.
Thank you,
And
Sharon.
yeah, we'll take all questions at the end.
Thanks, Sharon. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here. Uh, how is this? Do we see a PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, I
Very
see the
good.
PowerPoint. You
We see
just,
PowerPoint. How about now?
it's okay, perfect. What a
We're in?
nursery can do for pollinator-safe plants. Take it
Wonderful.
away.
Oh, hey, everyone. My name is Rich Campbell. I'm the greenhouse manager at M&L. That's Minnesota Native Landscapes. I've been doing this for, I think I'm going on my 10th year. I think that's right. Um, Talk a little bit about what M&L is. We're a full service ecological restoration company. So we do all sorts of construction services, prairie installation, shoreline, wetland, trout brooks, all sorts of stuff like that, buckthorn removal. Um, We work a lot with solar fields, planting prairies underneath, and then running a grazing operation to keep those prairies mowed. We have Red Rock Fire, which is our prescribed burn unit, um, which is an important part of habitat restoration as well. And those folks are also involved in wildland fire mitigation out west. And we have our vegetation management services too. After these sites are installed, there's lots of stewardship that goes involved to get them nurtured up to size and all that. Me, I work with the production side of the company, so that's where we're doing native seed and native plant production. Um, and I manage the greenhouse. Here's an overhead view of our farm. This is in Foley, Minnesota. And as you can see, we've got 6 greenhouses up here. There's actually 2 more in construction right now. So it's about 27,000 square feet of greenhouse space. I think that's going to turn to 36,000. I should check my math. We've also got outdoor production space, and you can see these rows around the farm. That's all field production that's for the seed production side of things. It's row crops, it's combines and tractors and all that. It's not corn and soy, it's native plants. Um, we're producing about 200 different species. I think we're going to produce about 1.6 million plants this year. I think it might be closer to 2 million. We'll see how things progress. Um, and we sell to all sorts of different places. We have an online retail center. We supply plants for garden centers. We work with county sales, so like soil and water conservation districts or city groups, that sort of thing. Tons of public projects, state, federal, city, otherwise. Work with lots of contractors. The native habitat restoration type contractors, and then all sorts of traditional contractors are incorporating native plants in their landscapes as well. And then, of course, M&L's own installations is a major part. Just some pictures of some of the bangers you might be familiar with. Me just trying to emphasize that these native plants are beautiful. Like I say, contractors and garden centers and all sorts of people are starting to incorporate this stuff alongside their traditional gardening and landscape practices. I'm here to talk about how to grow plants that are safe for pollinators. And really, I want to talk just safe for insects and the habitat in general. And kind of, the first focus on this is just thinking about plant health in general. And, we can talk about the pest and disease triangle, right? So we're looking at hosts, environment, pathogens, all being contributors to the health of a plant, right? It's a vulnerability to become troubled by pests. Something that's kind of unique with being a native plant producer is where I used to work in a traditional greenhouse and garden center, so I can appreciate like the differences and the challenges between those two things. But being a native plant producer, we're producing everything on site. Almost all of it is being germinated on site, and we're not importing plants from California or Florida or other places. And with that, we're not importing those very problematic pests, right? Um, the majority of the pests we encounter are native insects, which have co-evolved with the plants, and thus there's like natural resistances there. And furthermore, there's native predator insects that prey on those pests. So essentially, by creating a optimal growing environment, controlling moisture and temperature and all that, you're in that sense already promoting healthy plants, which should just further improve the resistance to these potential pests. And just kind of a demonstration of that, our greenhouses are for the most part very open air. We're trying to keep really regular airflow. Excess heat and excess humidity are kind of the key contributors to some of the problems you could face with plant health. In general cleanliness, we ain't perfect. We're trying to get better all the time. but even things just mowing weeds down, weeds around the perimeter of the landscape, reducing excess puddles, things like that. Those are all places that harbor potential diseases, right? And of course, just feeding plants the right nutrients, the right balance, right micronutrients, proper acidity. Um, Plant density is a big one too. Here on this image, I just have an image of some plants that we had recently trimmed back, and you can see, where it's close to the soil that potentially we should have done that even sooner. Where it's really dense, it's really humid, you start to see, fungal issues and that sort of thing. But even just doing this, even just trimming it back and adding some more airflow, these plants like almost certainly rebounded after this. Um, these are some images I had taken all in a single day. So this is all butterfly milkweed, and these are all crops at different stages of production. And this is one mechanism. This is like maybe the most fundamental mechanism we found to ensure that we have retail available plants at all times. So what happens is with these native plants, they grow like weeds, right? They get to a point where they're overgrown, and that's unfortunately an image I'm missing from this, which I wish was included. But there's this process that we all understand of getting plants up to size, but then they might hit the stage where they become overgrown, um, in which they're gangly and unsightly in a retail setting. But it's also oftentimes when I find them to be most inundated with insects and pests as well. So that's a crop that you might have to trim back. In doing that, you might even have to treat it. And in doing that, it's removed from being that like sort of retail quality. But because of the nature of these native perennials, that's only the case for a couple of weeks, and then they get to come back into the cycle. So essentially, if by staggering your production schedule all throughout the year, you can maintain that retail ready plants at all times. Um, I think that's significant for native plants in that autumn is, in my opinion, the ideal planting time. So, we're so culturally trained to do all our garden installation in, May, right? But we can do this with native plants all through the season. And it's also significant for the garden centers that we're supplying material to, in that not only can we have a good product on their shelves at all times, past the annual season, right? But there's this messaging that we get to work on together in which we can energize our customers to continue landscaping into the autumn time using these native plants. There's also this bit of philosophy here, in case I'm speaking to some greenhouse growers, where there's the retail quality plants. Sharon had mentioned these expectations that customers have about like plant perfection, right? There's strategies, in my opinion, to have these native plants look just as good as your traditional garden center plants. Now they might not be blooming and that sort of thing, but the foliage can look green and robust and all that, right? But like I said, it gets to a point where it becomes overgrown. Well, we can supply garden centers with that perfect lot, all throughout the year. If, as some of them are changing their practices to not bulk purchase a year-round supply in the beginning, but continue to receive, smaller orders throughout the season. But then, as a person who is, growing these plants, and ultimately they're supposed to be profitable in the end, and all that, right? Those plants that become overgrown and are no longer that retail quality, those are perfect and ideal for those major habitat restoration projects. Especially you consider that's getting past the summertime. It's when a lot of the best wetland installations and projects like that come into play. And it's a time of year where, because these are deciduous perennials, they're going to drop their foliage anyway. By that time of year, and in these landscapes where there's gonna perhaps be minimal maintenance going forward, it's not like a garden where someone's watering it every day, right? Really, like that root is where the real money's at. So now you can maintain a product that is for your retail folks, for your garden centers, for your gardeners, and simultaneously have a product that is better suited for the contractors and the big restoration projects. Um, So, why avoid insecticides, right? Kind of all the reasons Sharon had said, first of all. But just to elaborate a little, I mean, obviously, because pollinators, monarchs specifically, I mean, here's a photo of a little monarch on just a super tiny 2 inch tall, freshly germinated milkweed. In a sense, like the monarchs can be a pest in our greenhouses, right? Of course, we're not spraying them and killing them, but they can cause a negative impact to your economic threshold, right? Um, Here's a video of some monarchs completely decimating one of my lots of milkweed, which is actually like very, very fun and very exciting. I mean, this is what we like to see. And, to elaborate on this, this is the lot of milkweed that we're moving caterpillars onto. We're pulling it off of the lots that are intended to be provided to these garden centers, and we're giving them this space. And these plants, caterpillars are chewing them down. It's probably like September in this image. Um, these plants are all still going to go into a big restoration installation before the year's over or the next year. And again, this foliage is deciduous. It's going to shed. The money's in the roots. The ecological value. Well, there's ecological value right here, as you can see. But once it gets in the landscape, it's in the roots, right? So nothing's been lost from like an economic standpoint, so long as you can also simultaneously maintain that supply of that retail quality milkweed, which you do just by moving the pests over to here. Some other, pollinators to discuss, some other host plants. These every year I have these American painted ladies on our pussy toes. And I usually see the little cocoons or it's a cocoon and the droppings before I even see the caterpillar. But they do damage to the plant. It looks kind of unsightly. But for the most part, all the people that are interested in these plants are very excited about this correlation, right? Like, or we're trying to educate people that they're not, purchasing plants. It's not just about the plants, it's about the habitat, right? And here you have like that direct correlation right there. So this isn't a pest, this is like a feature. Um, and let's talk about pests in the landscape. So this is like getting really crazy for someone who, used to work in a greenhouse, someone who I grew up being a landscaper. I have a garden. There's pests, right? We talk about pest control in our garden and our landscape. Well, when you're working with native plants, you kind of get to abandon that a little bit because you've already like opened up to the idea that it's not about the plants, it's about the whole habitat. And the thing is, these pests, quote, these aphids are just the next tier up in the food web, which are feeding all the other insects, which feed other organisms and so on, right? So um, when you have a controllable population of pests, it's actually just a greater benefit to the whole ecosystem as a whole, right? So, up top we have like some oleander aphids, which are an invasive species and are problematic. And we have images of some predators that are, controlling that population, probably introduced predators even. And then below you have all sorts of other aphids, which, are not these invasive oleanders. And look at the sort of habitat that helps promote. And then beyond, pollinators too, these are all images of milkweeds with milkweed beetles on it, tussock moths. There's those, what are they called, soldier bugs, or all sorts of things beyond the pollinators that, we're most excited about benefit from these native plants as well. But it should be said that we do get pests and we do have to do things to control our pests. Here we have aphid casings. On the right, there's damage from an invasive sawfly that does work on our columbine. There's things that we have to do to, first of all, try to prevent, number one, disease triangle stuff. But, it gets to be a pressure where you do have to respond as well. And, we want to respond because we're in the business of selling plants, sure. But it's also just such a bummer when somebody wants to introduce these plants to a landscape and you can't have them available, right? So it's like even in like our just as ecologists, it's in our best interests to try to control these pests. So Sharon had discussed there's a memorandum, and maybe that's not the right word, but there's an agreement, but that Xerces helped formulate to help give some guidelines to nurseries about proper chemical use, right, and how to avoid things that would be hazardous in the environment. At MNO, like because we're in the business of growing native plants specifically, we had always been in a practice of very, very, very limited pesticides, absolutely no systemics, and we just don't even like much chemical use at all. In part because it's just not very fun to handle, right? Like staff don't like it, but furthermore, just because we understand that our plants have value beyond that purchase transaction. They're supposed to be food in the environment. So, honestly, something that was very helpful in talking to Sharon about these guidelines is we had been so concerned about not using any sort of, pest control that it was, costing us money, costing us plants, it was costing, crops to fail. And it was actually like helpful to have some guidelines to encourage us to use some stuff, responsibly that would still, fit these sort of restrictions, right? So, Sharon had mentioned a list of insecticides that are just do not ever use. Yeah, absolutely. For us, easy, done. Here's a much, much longer list of some plant or some insecticides that shouldn't be used or pesticides that shouldn't be used within, I believe, is a 2-week period is the recommendation. And even this is things that we avoid almost 100%. But there's a couple of things on here that we're striking, specifically these bacillus, these bacteria biocontrol, which is something we're implementing. Um, to kind of get into that a little bit, we've been working with Copert, which is a biocontrol group that creates all sorts of different predator insects or microorganisms or things like that for the greenhouse setting for folks to implement in an IPM program. Two of them that we're using are this bacillariid, which is it's a bacteria, and it acts as like a fungicide essentially. We're also using this isarid, which is I believe it's a fungus, it's a microorganism, and this is something that targets soft-bodied insects. The thing is, like I had said a few slides ago, we want to promote soft-bodied insects. It's so weird. We want aphids and spittlebugs and all the gross things nobody cares about to feed on our plants once they enter the landscape. So it's important to us that these things aren't still part of the plant after it's sold, right? So, with our production schedule, we are getting pretty regimented at knowing when plants enter which stage of the cycle, when they're going to become market ready, that sort of thing. So, we implement these sort of things during post germination, when we still have 3 to 4 weeks before these are ever going to enter the landscape, right? So, in doing that, we're doing a bunch of preventative care to protect our plants in the production cycle. But even this isarid, this biocontrol agent, which sounds so safe, we're concerned it's going to hurt bugs in the landscape. But reading the label, reading the philosophy talking to represents a Copert about it, the idea is that it's ran its course and the plant is safe of this, well within the time that we're going to be sending it to the market, right? Sometimes we do have to use some reactionary things. We've done all the preventive care we can, and we still have a pest outbreak. And we want to, eliminate that pest outbreak, not just because we have to make money selling plants, but because we want those plants to benefit the ecosystem. So we're working with a lot of plant-based oils like rosemary oil and clove and peppermint. Some of that stuff, honestly, and from my observation, it works really well as a preventative as well. Prevent those sawflies from even wanting to land on the columbine. And then there's soaps and sticking agents and desiccants and that sort of thing too. So through our entire production practice, at no point are we using any sort of systemic insecticide, fungicide, anything like that at all. I put a note down here to be careful not to damage plants. With these oils, if it's too hot, if it's too sunny, make sure they're not completely safe, right? So you still have to use this stuff with care. I wanted to bring this image up again, just to again reiterate how strategic it can be just to really try to target that end date in which you want the plants to hit the market and kind of work backwards from there along the production schedule. And if you have the capacity to keep that rotation going, it's great. It works great for us. And again, I want to bring this image up again as well, just to discuss all these different outlets they're going through. Again, kind of reiterate that we can simultaneously maintain that crop that's great for our online retail store or the county, the garden centers. And that's not necessarily even like the strongest plant for these major habitat restoration projects, which would be going to your contractors and your public projects and stuff like that. You know, we're very intentional about our IPM program here. We understand the significance of what our plants do to the landscape. And of course, I can't absolutely promise that when you see an M&L tag at a garden center that they're using the same practices. But I can say that with like a pretty fair level of confidence. We work very closely with the growers and the buyers at these garden centers. They understand the message, they're excited about it. And you really should feel safe when you see an M&L tag at one of these places to know that this isn't that milkweed that's been, damaged or it's good food for the environment, right? It's not saturated with chemicals and that sort of thing. If I'm allowed, just do the shameless promotion of M&L quick. We do have an online store. We sell native plants and seed online, and we ship right to you direct. Check that out, please, if you haven't. And some exciting news. We're going to be at the Minnesota State Fair this year. We were there last year, and it was our first year, and it was a lot of fun, and we've been invited back. So if you're a resident of Minnesota or come visit, please come see us. And then to close out, I just wanted to share this video with you. This is monarch butterflies on our latch with stylus field. So this is a phenomenon we get to see in the field production every summer. We'll do it once more. And that's it. That's the presentation. Thank you. I think we're available to take some questions and answers for a couple minutes.
Hi, Reg. Thank you so much. I think Sharon has already been busy answering some questions behind the scene, and it looks like you're going to take that first one about seed stock versus nursery and neonics.
Yeah, the question was asked, are residuals of pesticides such as neonics a concern in seed stock or only in nursery plant stock? I guess the short answer is, I guess we'd love to have better information on this. We have very limited information. But basically, residues can show up in any plant part, including seed. When you have a small seed and you're planting it later, our thinking is that the concentration is going to be very low throughout that plant tissue as that plant grows. So we focus on the plants themselves rather than the seeds when in doing our work. That's not to say that there's no risk at all. It's just there's certain risks that we are essentially setting to the side so that we can make progress on things that we think are more likely to cause risk. Another risk that we essentially set aside is risks that happen within the nursery itself. We're more focused on trying to make sure that the plants are safe when they're sold than if, everything is absolutely safe in the nursery. That 2 week window at the end, there are some risky pesticides that can be used during the process of sale. But again, given the decline that most of these pesticides follow, we're not paying attention to, and this is deliberate, to that portion of the risk so that we can focus on this larger question in our minds about what happens when those plants get into the environment. So I hope that wasn't too confusing or poorly said, but I just wanted to explain that we have made a choice to sort of sideline certain risks because we just don't think that they're as significant right now.
And I think this sort of follow-up question is not directly related to growing nursery plants, but there's a whole issue of neonic-coated seed in crops, and then the leftover seed in the fields or the drift that goes into the water, and the pollinators take it that way.
Right. So when you're looking at deliberately coated seed that's used on commodity crops like corn or soybean or cotton, a lot of plants, actually, a lot of vegetable plants can be grown this way. Um, that it is a concern partly because not so much that the concentration in the plant itself is very high, but these uses are so widespread throughout the United States. They've caused a lot of soil pollution, a lot of water pollution. It's actually the biggest use overall of neonics. And we know that there can be some major sort of ecosystem effects because of the how widespread that use is. So
So I see,
nurseries are a really small player in the big picture.
right, it all adds up, right? All goes
Yeah.
downstream. Rich, I see there's a couple of questions here for M&L. Do you want to talk about how far your distribution goes and how people can get plants from you?
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of ways to get plants. So, we might be working with your local county, or we might be present at a garden center nearby. Like I said, we do have an online store, which we ship direct to consumer. Um, and that ranges throughout the Midwest. So, there's a couple of thoughts with that. First of all, it's within a shipping range where plants could healthily arrive within a day or two. And second of all, we understand the significance of local ecotype, right? Um, Ideally, the closer you can keep to your source, the better. But I also have to recognize that in some of the places we're distributing to, there's just a lack of other options, right? Um, so yeah, ship around the Midwest. If you visit our site, I think you'll even see a map of how wide that ranges. Certainly not sending anything that's a species not native to the region, um, and just trying to stay as true as we can to the local ecotype thing.
And this is, I don't know, both of you could probably answer this question, but can you explain a little bit about what happens to a plant if it crosses uh, country lines, if it's from like a tropical place, and then what the rules are if it crosses a state line, etc.
Yeah, we're not shipping across country line, so it's not something I have to encounter. Though there is like some overlap with species, it's something that we're not doing. In terms of shipping across state lines, there's different states have different regulations, mostly relative to the pests that they have present, right? For example, there's different regulations regarding Japanese beetle in the Dakotas versus in Minnesota. So with that, there's extra efforts that go in before shipping plants out west. They're grown in not sterile, but in a screened location. They're surveyed extra originally. Is that a word? for there's canned for Japanese beetles. Um, there's certain you know practices and policies that we're like legally obligated to follow to ship in that direction. Um, for the most part, and elsewhere, the range that we're distributing to is similar climate, similar conditions, similar like pest threshold, and because of that, there's not too much regulation that we have to encounter. We just wouldn't ship plants to Florida. It doesn't make sense. You know what I
Okay,
mean?
right. So Sharon, can you speak to kind of the broader picture and I know some plants have to actually be dunked, for instance.
The bigger picture is just essentially that there's this whole plant regulatory system, plant health regulatory system that exists both nationally and internationally and also state by state. And as Ridge said, it basically to try to make sure that we don't import like damaging species, even though we do end up doing this, really, there's supposed to be a system in place to try to help prevent this. A lot of the pests that we have in the US, like emerald ash borer, they come from Asia or other places and they got into the US through shipping materials. So, um, the system that we do have is not foolproof, but the system also requires that if there's a quarantine pest, yeah, the nurseries might be required to either get a regulatory plant health certificate, something kind of called like that, or they might have to treat the plants that they have before they ship them. So this can result in additional pesticide exposure for these plants. So it's one reason to go with a local nursery because, and go pick up the plants yourself if they've got their own retail outlet. It's not going to be like automatically treated because it hasn't probably crossed state lines. But just be aware that this exists. And for large ornamental nurseries in the US, a lot of their plants are actually getting started overseas and they get shipped over here to the US. And they may have been treated with things that are not even legal here in the US when they were started in other continents or other countries. And so that's a risk for pesticides, it's a risk for pests. Again, it's a really big reason to buy local and buy native because you're generally not going to have big issues with that if you're buying local and buying native.